Previously on Her Hour.
Congregants are free to vote, although I'm apolitical.
Okay.
For a reason, because in my church, you have people from the MDC, you have people from the ZANU-PF, you have people from the CCC, you have people from other political persuasions. So I can't then align myself with a political party where I'm trying to be neutral in order to accommodate, the different, kinds of political persuasions of people in my congregants. But people are free. I believe to a certain extent we are a democratic nation where people are free to air their views and choose their destiny.
My church does not disallow us from engaging in the politics. If you determine that you want to support a particular political party, our church does not disallow you from doing that in the one sense. But what we generally do not do is use the pulpit or the church as a way of pushing certain political agendas.
Mutemo weda uticha kuti voterai ningi kana hurumende kana mutemo wa Mwari unoti zvinobva pasi pemwoyo wako fanana nemukadzi waunorora unorora weunoda.
The chiefs, they should be, that's my belief, that they should be apolitical because they are chiefs for everybody, irregardless of which party and all this stuff. But it can also just happen that that chief might belong to a party they want because they also have a right to belong to a certain party. So I believe that the chiefs and headmen, they should be apolitical.
You deserve a photo shoot every hour. It's your hour. Camera, lights, flash.
Tick, strike up, pose.
Oh, swag, drippy, click, strike up, pose. That's how me about to sing, but girl.
Are sanctions personal? Why do countries impose sanctions on other countries? Is it like what's the main reason behind it? Hello, our Rangers. Welcome back. As you can see, we are in this familiar background. I'm sure if you guys have been watching our episodes, this looks familiar to you. We have been in this position before. But as you know, we're continuing with our Miseducation through Misinformation series. And today we're here at the US Embassy in Harare. And I'm joined by the lovely Laura.
Hello, viewers. I hope you're doing okay. Yeah, I'm here doing the 5th episode.
Yes, this should be the
5th episode of Miseducation through Misinformation. So we're here.
And we are joined again by a very special guest. I'm going to allow you to introduce yourselves to our lovely followers and viewers.
Thanks. I'm Thomas Hastings. I am the Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy here in Harare, Zimbabwe. Chargé d'Affaires just being another word for the acting ambassador. We're between ambassadors in Zimbabwe right now, and I've been acting in that role since last August.
Awesome, great. So we wanted to talk about, we're looking at the political elements of how misinformation in political spaces spreads miseducation amongst, your populaces and young people and things like that. And I think one of the major elements of miseducation or misinformation, especially when it comes to the political realm, would definitely be the issue to do with, things like sanctions and things like that, especially in a Zimbabwean context. So I think before we dive into deep, we want to, start off with the basic questions. So the first question would be, what is the role of an embassy in any country? I think every country has embassies but 90% of the time, people don't actually understand.
It's true.
What embassies actually do.
It's true.
Why are you here?
No, it's a very good question. First of all, again, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me to be on your program again. It's good to have you back in the embassy, and Laura, who I'm meeting for the first time. I think this is a perfect question to start with because honestly, in my own life, my friends, my family members, they know that I'm a diplomat.
Yeah.
They have some idea of what that means. But sometimes you have a conversation and you realize they really don't actually understand what it means to work in the U.S. Embassy in Zimbabwe or in any of the other countries I've worked in. Yeah. So it's good to clarify. An embassy has a few core functions, and it's the same for any embassy in the world. much of what I'm going to say is exactly just as true as the Zimbabwean embassy in Washington as the American embassy here in Harare. So first and foremost, the responsibility of any embassy is to look after its own citizens. So if there are US citizens who are in any kind of trouble in this country, we are there for them to talk to help them through the situation. American citizens here are, of course, still subject to the laws of Zimbabwe. It's not that we take over the situation. But for example, something that diplomats do at some point in their career in any country is if there are US citizens in jail in the country where they're serving, we go and visit. We can't get them out of jail necessarily, but we make sure they're being treated properly according to the laws of that country, and we visit them and so on. We also, so that's the job of our consular section. The other big job that our consular section does is it handles the whole immigration function. So that's visas for Zimbabweans who want to visit the United States to work, to travel, for business, to study, for tourism, for whatever reason. So I was just down the hall before coming in here. Every day about 50 or 60 Zimbabweans are coming in to apply for various visas, and so we do that. The next sort of most fundamental purpose of any embassy is to facilitate government-to-government communication. So if the government of Zimbabwe has a message for the US government, they communicate it through us, or through me, or through their embassy in Washington. It can be either way. Sometimes there are topics of conversation where we're talking on both sides of the ocean at the same time. But for example, I was received last week by Foreign Minister Chaya. I went with a group of my colleagues and we discussed a number of issues. But that's a normal part of the diplomatic function, is that if the foreign minister wishes to talk to my government, he calls me down. And even if 5 minutes from now, if something came up and he wanted to talk to me again, he would call the embassy. I would get in the car and go right downtown. We also promote trade and investment with US companies. We don't direct US companies to invest in this country or in any country. It's up to them. For the US, the private sector is truly private. So a US company gets to decide what country it wants to do business in. But if there are US companies that are interested in Zimbabwe, either in selling their goods in Zimbabwe and investing in Zimbabwe, and they reach out to us, we will be part of that process to help them learn the lay of the land and see if they can do business here. And then finally, and this one's particular here, it's not true for all embassies in the world, but the biggest function of our embassy here is overseeing the assistance that we provide to the government of Zimbabwe. Assistance we provide to the people of Zimbabwe, not directly to the government, but through all sorts of partners, NGOs and PVOs, sometimes through UN agencies and so on. So that's actually the largest part of what we do here. If I were to take you to around the building here after the interview and you were to walk down the halls, most of the people you would see working here work with managing those relationships with our partners who are doing a variety of assistance, health assistance, of course, all of our work in fighting HIV and AIDS over the years, additional assistance regarding education, agriculture, economic development, and again, all of which is managed through Zimbabwean partner organizations that we work with. So managing those partnerships is the largest part of what we do here.
Okay. So in light of the US Embassy, you say that it provides assistance mainly to Zimbabweans through different humanitarian organizations. I'm going to mention them, but there is the PVO Bill, which was recently instated, and personally, is it anti-progressive?
So we have concerns about the PVO Bill, and we're not the only ones who have those concerns. We've raised those concerns publicly when I'm speaking to journalists like this. We've raised these concerns privately with the government of Zimbabwe, perhaps more importantly. In my meeting with Foreign Minister Chaya last week, this was one of the issues I brought up. Other embassies have also raised similar concerns. The United Nations, quite prominently in December of last year, the United Nations has certain what they call special rapporteurs for specific human rights. So there's a special rapporteur for the freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and 4 of those individuals issued an open letter to President Mnangagwa expressing their concerns about that PVO legislation, saying that they feared it would constrain the space where PVOs and NGOs can operate in Zimbabwe if it were passed. But then more important than all of those voices are the voices of the Zimbabweans themselves. So Zimbabwean organizations have been using the public comment process that's available when a piece of legislation is being debated to raise their concerns as well. The overriding concern for us is that there appears to be in Zimbabwe of late a growing hostility or suspicion about private voluntary organizations, especially if in any way they partner with the United States of America. There seems to be almost an assumption that if a Zimbabwean organization is receiving funding from the United States, even to do very good work, and I'll talk about what they do, but if they're receiving funding from the United States, it's as if they're doing something unpatriotic or improper. We strongly disagree with that. We're very proud of the work that we support in Zimbabwe. I spent most of last week down in Bulawayo actually visiting some of our assistance projects. Obviously, as I said, the bulk of our work here is in the area of health, and we've partnered with numerous Zimbabwean NGOs to get the HIV/AIDS epidemic under control. It's not simply by handing out medicine, but it's by building capacity, ensuring that the healthcare system continues to function, supporting nurses to be in clinics, to be in rural health centers, building laboratory capacity in Zimbabwe's laboratories. And actually that work in particular, building laboratory capacity, we were primarily involved in that work for maintenance of viral load testing. So when a person is living with HIV, when they're on their medication, they need to be tested periodically to ensure that the medication is having its effect and suppressing the virus. That capacity then proved very useful when COVID hit. We didn't know COVID was coming, but then Zimbabwe's labs had the ability to switch to COVID testing because of the work that we had been supporting over the years in the fight against HIV/AIDS. So the idea that these organizations are doing anything contrary to what's beneficial for the people of Zimbabwe, it's absolutely wrong in my opinion. I'm very confident that these groups are serving the people of Zimbabwe and contributing to make Zimbabwe a healthier and more prosperous nation.
Okay, so we're just going to cross over to Daniel from Open Party, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about what exactly the PVO Bill is.
Private Voluntary Organization Amendment Bill, also known as the PVO Bill, is basically an amendment of the PVO Act, which is a law which governs the operations in registration of non-governmental organizations that are in the area of humanitarian work, those that distribute maize, those that do counseling, those that provide health support, and all those kind of things. Those are the private voluntary organizations. They are the ones that are registered under this law. But you find that the coming in now of this bill now, it's also trying now to bring organizations that were originally not registered under the PVO Act to then register as private voluntary organizations. We are talking about organizations that are registered as trusts. They are under this law. They will be forced now to register as private voluntary organizations. The problem is that this bill now it gives the minister too much powers in terms of registration, in terms of overseeing the work or activities of private voluntary organizations. Because if you read the bill, it says that if the minister suspects that a certain organization is not being run in a manner in which it is supposed to be run, the minister is empowered to actually remove the executive of that organization and replace it with people of his or her choice. And you see that it then begins to raise issues of whether this bill now is not coming in to try and gag certain organizations, because you realize that there are certain organizations that have been working in the area of human rights, areas of accountability, and the current government has not been happy with the human rights reports that have been coming against it, and also the accountability reports. So naturally, we would suspect that those organizations in that kind of area will be the first targets of this law. So we believe that this is one of the areas where this law is bad. Then there's a question whether this bill or this law will affect NGOs only and not affect the ordinary citizens. Well, the actual truth is that this law will actually affect the ordinary citizens as well, because you realize that the PVOs, especially those that are in the area of humanitarian, where they give free medical health services, those that give counseling, those that give food aid, they will be affected in that the minister has power to remove the executive of those organizations and then appoint people who take over the running of those organizations. And that can actually put off people who bring their goodwill, bring their donations to be distributed through that organization. They can simply say, no, because we have removed it, people that we trust, therefore we cannot continue to give you our food aid to give to your people. Or they can simply say we are withdrawing our medical assistance. So you see that then affect the ordinary citizens. You realize also that the PVOs or NGOs, as many people would want to call them, they actually are a source of foreign currency revenue for the government. You realize that they pay taxes in millions of taxes in US dollars. So when these organizations are threatened by this act or by this law, it also means that those development partners that finance or that give grants and support to these PVOs will also withdraw their money or limit their funds, and that will also technically limit the revenue that will go to government. And the government usually uses that money to finance its social sectors, to finance infrastructure development. You see that the current regime is actually developing roads and all those kind of things. So some of that money, then if it gets affected, then it means that they will not be able to continue with the project of constructing roads and other infrastructures. It also violates freedom of expression and freedom of association. You realize that organizations with this law, they are forced not to associate with politics, but there is no clear definition of what what kind of politics the law is trying to talk about. So you will see that the organizations that will do things like research to determine, for example, the level of hunger, the level of suffering in the country, so that they can then use that information to look for food aid and support. So those organizations, they will be deemed to be involving themselves in political issues, because politics actually, when you talk of hunger, there is politics, because politics are talking about the distribution of resources in a country. So then that will end up affecting the citizens, because then the NGOs or the PVOs will not have enough data to be able to look for adequate support to use in supporting people. So what will end up happening is that most of these NGOs or PVOs will end up closing, and when they close, then it means ordinary citizens have no way to turn to for their medical support, for food and all those kind of things. But more interestingly, this law now is coming into to target those organizations that also deal with that represent citizens whose rights would have been violated. We are talking about your such organizations like Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights that represent people for free whose rights would have been violated, whether by other citizens or by the state. So technically, when those organizations are targeted, it means that those citizens whose rights are going to be violated, they have no one to represent them because they cannot afford legal fees. So it's going to be a challenge. So citizens are going to suffer in as much as these organizations are going to suffer.
Okay. All right, we're back. Thank you so much, Daniel, for explaining in layman's terms what exactly the PVO Bill is. So back to the issue to do with sanctions. A lot of times people feel like sanctions are a bit personal. It's like a bad breakup, and then, you get your family and friends to like make everyone feel bad about something. So are sanctions personal? Why do countries impose sanctions on other countries? Is it like, what's the main reason behind it?
Sure. Let me start by making a distinction between sanctions and ZIDERA. Because a lot of people know that there's a law in the US which is called ZIDERA, and I think people don't necessarily know the difference. So ZIDERA actually came first. ZIDERA was a law passed by the Congress of the US in 2001, when my government was very concerned about the democracy and human rights situation in Zimbabwe. And that law is actually very specific. It says that the US will not vote in favor of funding for Zimbabwe from the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on, until we feel that the situation has gotten significantly better here. And I'll talk more about what I mean by significantly better in a moment. But that was 2001. The sanctions were put in place in 2003, not by our Congress, but by our president, which at the time was President George W. Bush. And just to be very clear what we mean by sanctions, first of all, sanctions in this case means that an individual who is on the sanctions list is not permitted to do business with the United States, to have a bank account in the US financial system, to travel to the United States, to engage in a business activity with the United States. Targeted sanctions is just a word which means the sanctions are targeted against the individuals on the list. In other words, it's not sanctions against the country of Zimbabwe. I just got finished saying we have 50 or 60 Zimbabweans here this morning probably applying for visas to go to the States. There's clearly no ban on travel between our two countries, except for the individuals and in some cases companies which are on that list in particular. There are exceptions. For example, the United Nations is in New York, and we welcome government delegations from every country in the world to the United Nations for official meetings. President Mnangagwa and any members of his delegation would be permitted to go to New York for UN meetings. But the president would not then be able to buy a house in New York, for example, or engage in personal business because his name is on the sanctions list. Again, we actively support U.S. businesses who want to do business here, so long as they aren't doing business with somebody who is on that list. As for taking it personally, which was your question, I don't know quite how to answer. I looked it up before this interview to be sure. There are 9 countries in Africa right now where the U.S. has some sort of sanctions program. It includes Zimbabwe, of course. It includes the DRC. Ethiopia is the newest country. We just introduced an Ethiopia program last year because of the events that have been going on there. I believe we have 6 people on that list. Sudan, South Sudan. So Zimbabwe is not alone in having a sanctions program. At the same time, when we introduced the sanctions some 20 years ago, many other countries did so as well. Canada has a similar program. Australia has a similar program. The EU established a program. The United Kingdom, when they left the EU under Brexit, they then went ahead and established a list themselves. So we were far from the only country in the world who had concerns about the situation, and we use sanctions as one tool to convey those concerns. And then the last thing I want to say is that we also have sanctions programs which are not specific to a country, but they're specific to a certain issue. So, for example, we have sanctions programs against terrorism and terrorist organizations, for example, against drug trafficking, against corruption. And one of the most prominent examples from this part of the world recently is that in 2019 we added members of the Gupta family in South Africa, the family that had been so responsible for the state capture, to our corruption sanctions program. And again, the same restrictions. They could not visit the states, they could not do business with the states. And this was actually an extremely popular move on my government's part in South Africa because there were so many South Africans who were so angry at the corruption that this family had facilitated that they were very pleased to see the government take action on this.
What sanctions is America imposed on Zimbabwe? Because so many people want to know. Because from time immemorial, we've been saying sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. Even I grew up not knowing, like sanctions. Okay, sanctions. So what? What are the specific sanctions which America has imposed on Zimbabwe, and how do they affect the life of any average Zimbabwean living in here?
Right, exactly. So again, the sanctions are against the list of individuals. That list is public, and it's against them specifically, not against Zimbabwe as a country. So U.S. companies are free to trade with Zimbabwe if they want to. U.S. companies are free to invest in Zimbabwe if they wish to. People are free to travel back and forth, as I said. For Zimbabwe, the list was established, as I said, in 2003. When the program was established, we put 77 individuals on the list, all of whom were government officials. The prominent government officials who are still on that list today include President Mnangagwa, Vice President and Minister of Health, Vice President Chwenga, and the Defense Minister, Opa Jinguri Kashiri. Those are the only three members of the cabinet who are currently on the list. We also added to the list in 2020 Mnahimbe, who was at the time Minister of State Security, for his role in the political repression and violence of 2018. And then the most recent addition was Kurkwashe Tagwire for his role in facilitating state corruption. And these descriptions are on the website. If you go to the Treasury website, certainly for the people who we've listed recently, we include, not a long document, but a few paragraphs giving my government's justification for why we feel they should be added to the list. So the sanctions have a direct effect on those individuals. They're intended to have a direct and powerful effect on those individuals, but not on you, not on Vera, not on the ordinary Zimbabwean.
Okay. So these people have made it onto this list. So how do they get off the list? What do they need to do? What boxes do they need to tick?
Right. So there are two different ways that they could get off of sanctions as individuals. The first is that anybody who's on the list can actually appeal to be removed. We have a process whereby anybody who's on the sanctions list can reach out to the Treasury Department. We say Treasury Department in state, it's the Finance Ministry, but we say Treasury Department. And there's a page on their website that explains the procedure. And there have been Zimbabweans who had been on the sanctions list and then went through this process and were removed from the list. The second way, perhaps the more important way in terms of our political relationship, is that my government could choose to do away with the program altogether. And in fact, we did this recently with a sanctions program that pertained to Burundi. We had sanctions against certain Burundian officials that were established, I think, in 2015 because of the human rights situation in that country. And last year, my government, the official statement comes from the president, comes from the White House, said that the situation had changed sufficiently in Burundi in terms of government reforms and an improved human rights situation that the entire program was removed. And so that's possible as well. For Zimbabwe, you remember I mentioned that we have this law, ZIDERA. ZIDERA is very, in terms of our political relationship, ZIDERA is quite useful in that it actually contains a very clear roadmap for saying what are the types of changes the US government wishes to see to consider the situation improved in Zimbabwe. And there are 4 items on that list. It's rule of law, by which we also include respect for fundamental human rights, free and fair elections, steps toward transparent land reform, I believe that's the language, and then civilian control of the military. So those are the 4 topics that I bring up whenever I'm meeting with government of Zimbabwe officials. When I was meeting with the foreign minister last week, we talked on those 4 topics. These are the topics that have been a concern of my government for more than 20 years now. And when we see real progress in all of those areas, that's when my government might decide to remove the sanctions.
As we are currently in the infodemic era where everyone seems to know everything, but usually they don't know anything, where can Zimbabweans get correct and factual information about the sanctions imposed?
Great. So first and foremost, the information is online. And in fact, if I can even give you some links and you can put them in the comments, because the list of individuals on the sanctions list, that's public information. There's not meant to be any confusion or mystery.
It's not a secret.
It's not a secret. It's on the Treasury website, and we can put that link in there. I do talk to people who honestly sometimes don't know. I know one person who I think he was refused a visa many years ago, and has assumed, oh, I guess I'm on the sanctions list because I didn't get a visa, and he's not on the sanctions list. Another incident this happened just a couple of months ago. The embassy received a letter from a lawyer, and he said, I represent these two Zimbabwean citizens. They were trying to engage in some business in South Africa, and the South African bank refused to let them open a bank account, saying that they were on the sanctions list. But they aren't on the sanctions list. Can you please assist? And indeed, I wrote a letter that said, to whom it may concern, Mr. So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so are not currently on the sanctions list. They have never been on the sanctions list. Here is the link where you can see the sanctions list.
Yeah.
And as far as the US government is concerned, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to open a bank account. I'm not telling them to give them a bank account. It's their choice, of course. But I'm saying from the US government's point of view, as a simple matter of clarifying the situation, no, they aren't under sanctions. The bank should make whatever choice it wants to make. So we do those letters from time to time when we understand that there's confusion or problems that banks are being sort of overzealous than they need to be in terms of thinking that the sanctions caused them to do this or that. Another thing we can do in terms of information, we recently put together with our colleagues in Washington, who are the experts on sanctions programs, put together a podcast. I think it's a 4-part podcast kind of explaining things that I believe is on our website, but again, I'll give you the link and you can put it, where do I point?
Here,
down here.
on the screen, right here. Yeah. Okay, that's great. So recently, and for those of you who watch this, it happened recently in our timeline. I know that there's some people who are protesting outside the embassy with issues to do with the sanctions. I'll put it in quotes because I don't think they fully understand the extent of these sanctions. But they submitted an appeal to the embassy. So what would the process be like if with this letter? Then what happens from here? That they've submitted something here, then what happens?
Sure.
So the large box of files that are just looked at. And, okay.
So there's been a group of protesters camped in front of the embassy since I think March 2019. So what's that? Over 3 years now. Saying that they will remain camped there until the sanctions are removed. It reminds me, actually. You've been to the U.S. Have you been to the White House? You haven't. No. When you go to the U.S., go to the White House, and across the street from the White House, the President's house, right across the street from the White House, there's a demonstrator there who I think has been there for 30 years or something, demonstrating against nuclear weapons, I believe. Look, peaceful protest is fine. They've been peaceful 99.9% of the time that they've been here for the last 3 years. So we don't object to their being here. And of course, it's a right that Zimbabweans have to peacefully protest in favor of whatever opinion that they have. Their actual presence there isn't what's going to make the sanctions go away. The sanctions will go away if my government sees that there has been real progress in democracy and human rights and the things that I was talking about. They met with our former ambassador twice, I believe. They did come. They said they had a letter and a pile of letters that they wanted to deliver to the embassy, so they came and gave that to us a few days ago. And they are delivering letters to each of the African American congressmen in the U.S. Congress, saying, please come to Zimbabwe and see what the sanctions are doing, and so on. So we will deliver those letters back to Washington. And as an embassy, we are always happy to have members of our Congress come and visit at any time. We haven't had any in the last couple of years because of COVID. I think 2018 was the last time we had members of Congress visiting Zimbabwe. But that's their choice. If members of Congress wish to visit, we're always happy to have them.
Great. Awesome. So I don't know. I think that's enough information, guys. Straight from the horse's mouth. He is representing. No, but I think it's really important that a lot of young people, especially given the time that we're going into like this is our time to kind of understand what's happening, especially in our political spaces in this country, and that affects our everyday life. So it's really important to understand, you know, different elements. Make sure you do your research. Do your research, guys. It's so important. As Mr. Hastings said, is that you can go online and literally Google this information. I remember a few years ago when I was really curious about sanctions, and I Googled it, and literally it had a list of names, and I was like, my name isn't here, my daddy's name isn't here, so I'm fine. Like, let me apply for my visa. No, but I think it's really important to do your research, look up this information. As you all know, like we've said it here, it's public information. And even issues to do with the PVO Bill, there's so many things that are happening in spaces, in our economic spaces in Zimbabwe, in the political spaces in Zimbabwe. And it's so important for you to read up on it and to understand it clearly so you can make more informed decisions. So thank you so much for giving us your time.
Absolutely.
And thank you again, Laura. And to our team behind the scenes, we have a whole crowd of people here, guys. Like, we just told them not to say anything, but they're like 50 people in this room. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, thank you so
Vera,
much.
can I say one more thing?
Yes, you can.
Just because we've spent a lot of the time talking about sanctions, and I understand that's often what's on people's mind. But I also want to say, you know, from our point of view, as I said in the beginning, that's not the primary feature of the relationship that we have with the people of Zimbabwe. We were just talking before the camera started. As an example, we brought a musician. The embassy brought an American musician to Zimbabwe last week. I had lunch with him down in Bulawayo and with some other musicians. He gave a concert in Bulawayo. He gave a concert here. He gave a workshop on intellectual property here, right? To talk about making sure that musicians can get fairly compensated. And then we had a concert last Saturday where Vera was the MC. And just to see, you know, an American musician with Zimbabwean musicians up on stage, Americans and Zimbabweans in the audience enjoying themselves. That type of friendship, to me, is very natural between our two countries. I really feel that the US and the people of Zimbabwe have a very naturally good relationship. I see it in the partnership that we do here with all the assistance that I mentioned. It's true that our governments have a difficult relationship, and that difficulty has a reason, and the reason is that we have real concerns about democracy and governance in this country. But I'm leaving in a month, actually. I don't know if you know, my 3 years are up as a diplomat here. But what I'm really going to take away from me is the very natural, positive relationship that exists and should continue to exist between the people of America and the people of Zimbabwe.
And just to mention, like, some of the really amazing programs that the embassy does offer, especially to young people, the programs like, you know, the Yali program. I know there's the IVLP, Global Moment in Time as well. So there are lots of, like, I've just mentioned two, because those are the two that I'm most familiar with, but there's so many, there are multiple programs that I know that the US Embassy has that assists young Africans, young Zimbabweans, young people in general to just get to meet each other, to support their work. So I think a lot of times, like you're saying, that just because the higher level, when the parents are fighting, the kids can still get along really well. And that's how I like to look at it. So yeah, that is really important. And I think we'll also add some links for those of you who are interested to just understand some of the really amazing programs that the US Embassy offers to young people. And you guys can click on something, and who knows, you might find yourselves meeting really, really amazing people through some of these amazing programs.
Great.
Yeah, awesome. So yes, guys, don't forget to subscribe and to follow us and to leave your comments. Let us know. Yeah, comment section below. Let us know how you're feeling. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know if you enjoyed the conversation. If you disagree, you're free to disagree. We want to know what you're thinking and how we can maybe try and explain things a bit better. But thank you so much, guys, and have a great one. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, swag, drippy, drippy, click, strike up, pose. Clap for, what up? She already paid her dues. Word. Clap for, wagon. She already paid her bills. You are something of amazing chocolate beauty with brains mixed in one. She got it from her mama.